organizer of Sino-American Talks. This is a series of presentations and discussions focused on exploring the relationship between Chinese society and American society. If you're interested in helping us with future events, please do get in touch with me. We're always looking for more speakers. We're always looking for people who can help us out in miscellaneous other ways. So if you're familiar with video editing or marketing or anything that you think might be of assistance and you're interested, please come speak to me. Tonight's event is much more focused on the China side rather than the American side. We have 3 individuals who have published numerous pieces on Chinese politics, Chinese culture, and various aspects of Chinese society. And they've agreed to speak with us here tonight about Chinese youth. Whether you want to call it Balingho or Jiulingho or millennials, or you have some other word, this is the nebulous group that we're going to be discussing tonight. We're going to take a look at their role in society and hopefully come away with some of our misconceptions remedied and our false assumptions corrected. Our goal for this evening is not for it to be a one-sided lecture, but rather to be a discussion and an exchange. First, let's get to know our panelists a little. Eric, I'm going to start with you because you have come such a long ways to be with us. What have you been up to for the past couple of years?
Okay, so I'll talk about how I got into this topic. I first came to China in 2007, teaching English, like many Laowai do. I did that for 3 years at a university, and that time I kind of really got interested in this topic of Chinese youth because so many crazy changes are happening in China so quickly, and I think whenever that happens in a country, it's the youth that most distinctly show these changes. So after that, I went to grad school here, studied journalism, and then for several years I worked for a Chinese newspaper, Economic Observer, and I did a lot of features along these lines of young Chinese and how they're navigating the sorts of socio-political, economic issues that are quite rapidly shifting in China. So I wanted to look at these broad macro trends playing out in China and how they're affecting normal people. So I started to realize there might be a book's worth of stories there. So for the last couple of years, I've been writing my book, China's Millennials, the Want Generation, where I profile lots of different, very diverse people, from migrant workers up to social activists and people doing all sorts of interesting things. And a year ago, I moved to New York, where I've been working at Asia Society. And since then, kind of dovetailing with that topic, I've been researching Chinese overseas students in the US, to see what brought them there and how that kind of dovetails with what's going on with young Chinese here. So.
Now, Eric, you're just back in Beijing for a week or 2 weeks. What is it that has brought you back here at this moment?
To do fun things like this. For one, see old friends, and there's a couple stories that I'm working on. I'm going to do interviews and research on.
Okay. Now, Karoline, you used to work as a staff writer for That's Beijing magazine, right?
Yes.
And you're currently with Radio France International. Mm-hmm. You do a lot of reporting in English, correct?
Yes.
Do you speak French as well?
Well, trying to, but it's really hard. It's much harder than English, I would say.
Okay. How do you think your writing or your thinking has evolved over the past couple of years? Because I've read several of your pieces, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on how things have changed.
You mean like youth culture or what's changed?
I'd like to start out just with you and your writing. Some of it which is about youth culture and young people in China, but some of which is about many other topics.
Okay. Yeah, I think before I become a writer for That's Beijing, I didn't realize that the generation. I didn't know that my generation can be so interesting, because once you are in the generation, you never realize that there is stories. But when I started to write the stories, people around me who read the stories tell me that, oh, that's interesting. So gradually I started to pay more attention to my own generation and the last generation, even the younger people. And I feel like the more I write, the more I research, the more I understand myself and my friends around me.
Excellent, thank you. Now, Alec, what is the Anthill?
Oh, the Anthill is a website which I set up 3 years ago, which is, we call it the Writers' Colony. It's a collective of writers in Beijing and all around China. And the idea behind it is that everyone in China, everyone in this room, has a story to tell about China, has something they've witnessed, has something that they want to write. I always think that everyone in China is a writer, because on every street corner you see something worth writing about. The Anthill is the space which me and my friend Tom Pellman have set up for people to tell those stories in a more narrative way, and perhaps a slightly less journalistic way. We're interested in something that happened to you on the street corner rather than trying to encapsulate a topic in sort of comment or analysis.
Now, you're pretty well established in Beijing, pretty well known as a writer, but I saw online that you are also working on a book about Chinese youth.
Well, aren't we all? So, let's see. In my China story, I think I'm pretty much exactly a year behind Eric in all ways. I first came here in 2007 for a summer's teaching in the west of China, and then I came back in 2008 to do 2 years of language. I did my prison time in Wudako, and then since 2012 I've been writing full time. Moved into the Hutongs with this, I think, fairly vague notion of being a writer. And the last 3 years I've been following 6 young Chinese people. I've been writing a book about their stories from childhood up to today, and that will be published next spring in the UK.
Will I be able to get it at the bookworm?
Yep, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. And by the way, let me take this opportunity to say hello to everyone and thank you to Joseph for organising this event in such a beautiful venue. I think I was just realising now that, having been steeped in Chinese youth culture for so long, I think that it must have rubbed off on Eric, Karoline and I, because when you were all turning to the person to your right and introducing yourselves, we took a selfie. which isn't the exclusive domain of Chinese youth, but I think we've been under that influence.
All right. Well, the first question that I would like to ask all three of you about Chinese youth has to do with this category or this label. You know, whether you want to call them millennials or Balingho or Jiulingho, I'd be curious as to your thoughts as to what ways these labels are useful categories for thinking about a single cohesive group of people, and in what ways they may be useless or even harmful to clear thinking, talking about a group of people which is very diverse.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with any of those labels in and of themselves. I think they are useful, like at a sociological level. There are, some differences when you do surveys in the aggregate. But yeah, when you talk about people born in the 1980s and 90s, that's 400 million people in China. So we do have to be very, very careful not to generalize very broadly. And I think what's really interesting about young Chinese today is how diverse they are becoming compared to earlier generations, how individualistic people are, and that's kind of the thing that's very humbling. Like, writing this book was just kind of gives a preview of how much I have no idea about still, how much there is left to know. So I kind of tried to zero in on some people, but yeah, if you get too generalized using these Jiulingho, Balingho, and it's very popular in Chinese media to label people like this, and like TV shows you'll see that label, and I think that kind of evokes certain stereotypes in China and abroad as well that are very often not flattering. I think more often than not when you see those labels it's unflattering reasons. So, I guess.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's a bit overgeneralized to say post-80s, post-90s. And I think even every 5 years there can be a generation. Like me and my cousin, he's 5 years younger than me, but our attitudes on certain things are definitely different. And I want to point out that post-80s is not the first label we put on young Chinese people. I remember clearly when I was younger, people started to talk about how badly behaved the post-70s are. and now when we look back, we see those irresponsible post-70s, they are the parents now. They are taking most of the responsibility of the society and the family. And now when we look back and read the articles they report on the post-70s, we think, oh, it's totally different than the image of post-70s we see today.
I completely agree with everything Eric and Karoline have said. I'd also add that whenever anyone says something sweeping about young people, that's not exclusively in China. I think we've all had and heard our parents' generation talk of us, the X generation, the Y generation, in exactly the same way: selfish, pathetic, brain dead. The me generation seems to be the favourite catchphrase, I think, of anyone over 40 talking about young Chinese. As Eric said, this is a group we're talking about which is the same size as the US, and if you're talking about bilingual Chinese, that would include someone born in 1980 into a country which is still very, very poor and finding its feet in the world, and it includes someone born in 1989 who grew up with China in the WTO, China having had a successful Olympic bid. It would include a hairdresser in Heilongjiang, and it would include a Furodai in Hainan on a tropical island. So I think we all wanted to diffuse that bomb before we begin by saying that you obviously can't make a sweeping generalization. I think the one simple thing you can say is how complicated and diverse they are, and I think that's part of the story, because they're the first generation who had the opportunity to be diverse, had the opportunity to have a youth culture. Their parents' generation, by and large, didn't have that opportunity. They only had one course in life, and it's from the 1980s, and the generation who are natives of the more opened up China, who can be that transition, who can be that thin edge of the wedge.
Well, continuing this idea of overgeneralizations, I'd like to ask all three of you about the worst stereotypes, or the worst misconceptions, the most inane generalizations that you have heard, or that you've encountered about young Chinese people today.
Apathetic. Shall we do a list? We can play this game. One word each. Apathetic.
脑残怎么说？
Brain dead.
Brain dead.
I would say brainwashed.
Yeah.
Is
So
terrible
there's
stereotype.
Selfish, rebellious.
Materialistic.
I think it falls into two camps, I'd say. Either they're disengaged and apathetic, or they're brainwashed nationalists, which is sort of a variation of the 60s, everyone in Mao suits, bog standard yellow apparel.
Yeah.
And apathetic is a variation of what my granddad says about me, so.
Yeah, I think the one big story, like I'm sure all of you regularly read reports about Chinese youth issues, but I think for most people around the world, one of the big stories comes around every 5 years when there's a Tiananmen anniversary, and reporters seek to see, well, why is this generation so different than the students in the 80s that had these idealistic ambitions and protested for democratic reform. And the narrative always seems to be, this generation, after Tiananmen, this very patriotic education was introduced and the economy exploded. So I think the narrative is that this generation has been pacified on one hand by nationalism and on the other by materialism, focused on much more materialistic, tangible things than sort of lofty ideals. And I think that this narrative has its place, or had its place, but I think really starting to get away from that. And I really think if that's the story you take away, which I think is the big story a lot of people see that aren't that familiar with China, that's just so misleading and so inaccurate for so many young people in China. So that's kind of the stereotype that irks me the most.
A couple of years ago, Alec wrote a piece called China's Youth, Do They Care About Politics? And he kind of hit the nail on the head with a lot of these stereotypes. He wrote that they are much too varied to generalize. This doesn't stop their elders from characterizing them as selfish, irresponsible, vacuous, and spoiled. The stupid generation, in one intellectual's phrase. Now, those all seem pretty extreme. Is there any element of truth in these claims? Or is this simply the age-old practice of old people looking at younger people and saying, I was tougher than you when I was your age? Because I know my grandparents do that to me.
So here's the thing, I think there is always a kernel of truth to be found in stereotypes, in generalizations. So let's take both of them, the two that we've identified. Let's say apathy and nationally and brainwash. I think apathy, disengagement from society. I think there's something there. But I think it's for different reasons for why the stereotype exists. I think the lazy way to say it is that they're disengaged from society because they've been bought off by a consumer society, that they're materialistic. I think anyone who's talked to a Chinese person longer than 10 minutes feels that that's perhaps slightly patronizing. At the same time, I think being part of a transition generation means that you have to face with so many daily pressures. And being a young person in China, I don't think anyone else would disagree, isn't particularly easy unless you're Wang Cong and you can buy 2 Apple phones for your dog. It's tough. Right? There's certain expectations for both genders. There's a lot of pressure from your family. There's that generation gap between you and your parents. And if every day you're worrying about earning enough to put aside savings to get a mortgage or buy a home outright, where's the time to take the action which from the outside would seem like you're engaging with society? But what that doesn't mean is that you're not invested in China. Of course you are, it's the country that you live in. I don't think I've met a single person who doesn't care about the future of China. It's more a question of what comes first.
Sometimes people say the younger generation don't care about politics. I think that is not very true. I think to care about politics, there should be 2 conditions. First is they know what they are going to care about. For example, in 1989, if they know it and if they find the occasion, probably they will also say something stand out. Like in 2009, on my campus, most people didn't know the day, so they didn't do anything. Another thing I think is to create a platform for students to shout out their what they want. Like in this current system, sometimes the government just tell you what you can do or what you cannot do. For example, when there's dispute on the Diaoyu Island, you see lots of young people just went out in the street and protest. It is politics. It shows that young people care about politics. Just that the government allowed people to go in the street, so it happened. But on other issues, maybe they just forbidden it, so it didn't happen.
Young Chinese can be perfectly aware of everything that's going on in their country, perfectly aware of all the problems, perfectly aware of all the political issues, and still not share the opinion that China should be an open democracy like in the US, shouldn't have the exact same kind of political system. That's what I found talking to a lot of Chinese youth over the years. I've been surprised by how much young people know compared to how brainwashed a lot of people think that they would be in the West. And I think sometimes interactions with foreigners and young people can reinforce this. If a foreigner comes in and meets a young Chinese and challenges them on these tough political issues, I think there's sometimes a defense mechanism where Chinese feel, well, you're kind of insulting my country, or you don't have a full picture of it, you're giving an incomplete or ignorant picture, so I feel the need to defend it, even though I myself might be very critical of my own leaders. One example, one guy I talked to that really left an impression, I don't know if any of you remember this, in 2008 when there was this anti-CNN website that sprang up after these riots in Tibet. I talked to this guy who started this website that was very fiercely critical of foreign media and what they viewed as biased and inaccurate reports. And so when I talked to him, he laughed and he said, the first thing reporters always ask me is, are you being paid by the government? Are you on the Communist Party's bankroll? And he laughed because he said, that's impossible. I love criticizing the government too. I just want to have a fair view of China, and it's fine if foreign media says bad things about China as long as it's true. And so I think we need to better appreciate that these things are not contradictory, where Chinese can be very critical of their own system, but also very patriotic and go to something like an anti-Japan protest. And I would agree that Chinese youth are much more political than they ever get credit for. It might not be the way that we would like them to be political in the West sometimes, waving democracy banners, but I mean, look at Weibo whenever some kind of big event breaks out. Intensely political issues like feminism, pollution, corruption, media freedom. We saw the Southern Weekend protest a few years ago against censorship. It was mostly young people outside protesting there, uploading pictures of themselves on Weibo. So yeah, I think this generation is much more political than the apathetic stereotype would suggest.
Although, that said, in Eric's book, you got, I think, the best quote I've ever seen out of Rao Jun, the founder of Anti-CNN, when he said, "I'm a Libra, so I don't care about politics." But I think that's exactly right, and it's important to remember that you can be patriotic without being a blind supporter of the Communist Party. It's about not being essentialist and thinking of things in certain blocks and associating, taking everything, lumping everything together. I mean, when we talk the topic of this, I mean, this is a Sino-US talks, and I think one of the main meeting points between Sino and US young people is students abroad, Chinese students abroad, getting an education in America and vice versa. I've been talking recently to a friend who spent a year in Cornell, and she said that when she went over there as a Chinese, the questions she was getting were all so aggressive in a certain way, or sort of pushing her to say a certain thing, that she just found it so much simpler not to engage, not to talk about.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I think most of the time the image Chinese young generation present to the Western media is that they are very patriotic or they don't care about politics. But in my case, sometimes if I meet foreign friends, I try to defend China, and if I go back to my home, I just say, like, Chinese government should change this, that, and that. So I think it's sometimes quite different, like it depends on who are you with and at what place, location.
And I would add too that this idea of nationalism being incompatible with pushing for like political changes within China. I mean, look at history, look at how many times these very ardent anti-foreign protests in China have turned against China's leaders. There was the May 4th movement. There were various movements throughout the 30s criticizing the government to do more to stand up against Japan. And even 1989 had roots in nationalistic protests against Japan in the mid-80s for various issues, and then that kind of morphed into people saying, well, why aren't you leaders doing more about this? Like, you've become so corrupt that you're selling our nation out to these foreign powers, and then that sort of transitions, you start to see these slogans intermingled, and then it shifted towards being wholly against domestic issues. So I think these things are very related in that young Chinese that are very patriotic, and not only about foreign issues, but wanting their leaders to be good, pure leaders that take their country in the right direction. So yeah, I don't think these things are contradictory.
I'd like to move on to ask you guys a little bit about cultural change. This is going to get a little bit complex. Now, when I was in college, I remember learning a lot about modernization and westernization and how so many countries go through a really big kind of identity struggle in an attempt to modernize without westernizing. Now, from my personal viewpoint, lots of young Chinese people are receiving lots of cultural influence from the United States, from Australia, from other countries that are culturally Western. They certainly seem to me more globalized than their parents or their grandparents were. Does this mean that these young people are more westernized? Does this mean that they are less Chinese? What is this? Because it's definitely a very different type of being Chinese than what existed 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, I think it's really hard to make. It's very hard to find the borderline between westernization and modernization sometimes. Sometimes I think when people tend to think the most of the modernized concept of theory are Western, but I think it's a mix. Like, it is a mix of Western culture, Indian culture, Chinese culture, Japanese culture. So yeah, that's my opinion.
And international influence isn't just Western influence. I would say that Japanese porn has been more influential on young Chinese people than Coca-Cola.
A lot of Western journalists and a lot of Western writers in general have this idea that as China modernizes, it will grow more liberal, it will become more Western. Is there any truth to that, or is that complete rubbish? Your thoughts?
Yeah, it depends how you look at it. Like, I don't see the grand system going that way. It seems to be going the opposite direction, in fact. But, I mean, yeah, if you look at the young people, how individualistic they're becoming. I mean, you have youth culture, you have youth subcultures, you have just all this vibrant, and when you like say Chinese culture, I think that's changing. I mean, what is Chinese? I think that's evolving. Just like in the US, American culture today is quite different than American culture 20 years ago. So Chinese culture is evolving, and yeah, having outside influence, and I think that's a good thing, and that people are really starting to find their voice. And this I think that's really acute in China, because now you have a generation that grew up with the internet, exposed to all these different points of view, all these different ideas, and seeing that if there's something that I'm attracted to, I may not be so weird. So you have like goth culture, you have hipster culture in China now. It's okay to be LGBT. Like, you can embrace these identities that make you feel comfortable. So when I see all this happening, I wouldn't say that it's like these things happened in the West earlier because I think they were allowed to earlier. But now China, now that all this information is available, people have much more freedom. When the older generation in China was growing up through the 70s and 80s, this Danwei work unit was very important, where basically the government lorded over your personal life. The place where you worked had a tremendous influence on your personal life. You had to get permission to get married or to travel somewhere. They would even monitor women's menstruation cycles to make sure they weren't getting pregnant. Very invasive. And now you have this generation that is the first one to come out of age without this system kind of lording over their daily lives. They've had, as much as we hear about the lack of freedoms in China, this generation grew up with tremendous freedom compared to the past, so they're being allowed to explore these very diverse, different lifestyles. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say that's so much westernization. I would say they're being allowed to embrace things that appeal to them. That's different for everyone.
Let me sort of continue adding that historical perspective, because I think it's super important to connect the historic narrative up to today, because we didn't come out of the vacuum. So the question is about westernization and how that changes China. Eric and I, over noodles for lunch, were talking about young Chinese in the 80s. And I think that's a very interesting comparison for those people who are now in their 40s, I guess, and young Chinese today. In the 80s, it's been likened to coming out of a dark room to be dazzled by the lightness. Suddenly, in China, you can listen to jazz, you can watch foreign romantic films, and from what I've read, it seems like there was such excitement about that foreign culture, such excitement about American culture. And I think the real dividing line, if we're talking generationally, is people who were born with no memory of anything before that. Born into a country with patriotic education, which started in 1991 as a response to Tiananmen, and born into a country which is also becoming richer on its own path. And I think that's created a generation who I'd venture the generalization are more confident in their country's path, more confident in China being strong as China, rather than China perhaps emulating some aspects of the West, which a lot of people in the 80s called for, as they did in the May 4th movement in 1919. I think that's a trend which is only rising as China becomes stronger on the world stage, as the West seems to have some chinks appearing in its armour. I think we're actually going to see more and more young Chinese who, although they have a lot of international influence, are actually much more confident and strong about being Chinese and not being influenced by the West.
Okay. Well, I think we've had enough of my questions. I'd love to open it up to the audience Q&A. If you have a question, just raise your hand.
I think it's, of course, the one-child policy has never been, it's always been porous, and it's always, it's never been as much of a behemoth as I think it's sometimes understood outside. A lot of my Chinese friends have brothers and sisters, and I also think that growing up, you never lack for friends. Often it's your cousins who are your siblings. That said, there are definitely impacts. I think the main one to take away is the fact that you're your parents' only child. And that means that all of the pressure that a parent would normally give to their child is doubled, both by the fact that that parent missed their youth and wants so much more for their children, and then doubled again, squared, by the fact that they only had one. So I think that gives some of the ideas of sort of how difficult it can be to be a single child in China. So that's one thing I'll say.
I think sometimes single child policy it's not all about negative. It's not all negative. For example, one family can pour all the resource to the only child. When we define or when we say if a generation is better or worse, it's not just about if he can be able to cooperate or he is selfish or less selfish. Sometimes there are more standards, like if he gets more better education, if he's polite enough, if he is nicer. I think so. One child policy. Sometimes people always criticizing for it makes the generation like little emperors and little princesses, and they are not able to cooperate. They are being selfish. But on the other hand, maybe they can be even better on other aspects.
Yeah, that's definitely where the little emperor spoiled stereotype comes from in large part, is this one-child generation. But yeah, like I think that's starting to come the other way around now. China is the first non-developed country now that has an aging population that's aging very, very rapidly, because you have this whole one-child generation. Now the generation above starting to retire as they take on this burden. China's the first country to experience this without having the first world resources to deal with it. So of course all the pressure that comes with this is going to be put on this one-child generation to care for these older people. And like you said, this is creating huge pressure within families to go through the standard life steps that you would think, yeah, study hard, get into a good school, get a good stable job, get married as quickly as possible, have a child as quickly as possible, and just make sure that your future is set. And this isn't jiving with a lot of young Chinese today. A lot of people want a different path than that. A lot of women want to focus on career for a while and get married later, not get married at all, not have a child at all, have some kind of alternative lifestyle that's not a stable job. And this is really not jiving well with the older generation. An overseas student in New York I talked to a couple weeks ago, she put it this way. She said, "My parents want me to pursue materialism, but I want to pursue meaning." And it's very hard to do that in China right now. This girl is an aspiring journalist and not a great career in China right now. But yeah, she just really, like, that's part of the reason she came to the US and wants to stay there, is to kind of escape from this pressure in her family. But she came up wanting to do something, wanting to make something of her life that goes beyond just a paycheck. And I think this is one of the big markers between generations, is the older generation. I mean, they grew up in very hard times, and when the economy started opening up and getting better, then they were more secure than they'd ever been, and definitely more secure than their parents have been, and they want that for their children as well. But now you have children that grew up somewhat comfortable, and they are not pacified just by economic growth and being material comfort. So I think starting to want more out of life.
You mentioned about some of the pressures on young Chinese women nowadays. As a person who is not a young Chinese woman, I read a lot about women being derided as leftover women. I read a lot about the pressures on young women, first to study a lot, do not date, and then as soon as they finish school, instantly you must find a husband and settle down. I want to broaden this up and ask, what is the state of feminism today? What is the state of women's rights and that awareness among young people? Do young men in China have a similar, a greater, a lesser awareness of these issues than young men in other countries that you've experienced? This is a whole bundle of issues. But if you could just peek into one or two of those, I'd really appreciate it.
Last year, I participated in a monologue on the stage called Leftover Monologue, and actually it was the first time for me to realize that there are so many issues that make young Chinese women like so pressured. Because, well, I'm not a single child, so probably I experience less pressure on marriage because my brother is already married and has a boy. And there are several cousins who are even older than me and still not married, so I feel the pressure is more on them. I'm very lucky. But definitely, yes, I think the young Chinese women today are facing a lot of pressures. First, they want to be independent, they want to have their own career, but on the other hand, their families always pushing them to get married. And what makes this situation worse is when we were younger, we are not allowed to have any relationship. But then when we get out of university, our parents ask us, hey, where's your boyfriend? I said, hey mom, I listened to your advice, I didn't make any boyfriends. But why you are asking me for a potential marriage partner? Yeah, I think sometimes, and also some other issues, like if you see like a fair, people always criticizing women, like tempted the men, but not accusing the men in China. And also, if you see a single mom in the street, people criticizing her for not respect herself, but not criticizing the guy who just left them. I think what made the situation worse is that it's not only men who are trying to defend the old order, the old system, the old principles. There are always a lot of women who are trying to do the same thing, to defend the old order, to make them feel special, or make them like morally better. So I think that's the problem.
Eric, in your book, you've got a section that speaks a little bit about the All China Women's Federation and how this idea of the leftover woman came to be. Could you just give us a quick summary of that and what you think are some of the motivations or the reasons behind that?
Yeah, so I should mention first, this is Leda Hong Fincher that first flagged this this leftover woman campaign. So I think it was around 2007. The All China Women's Federation, the state feminist organization, started publishing all these like commentaries, kind of chastising leftover women, say like, oh, they're not worth our sympathy, because a lot of times they just go out, hook up for one-night stands, and like, aren't interested in getting serious. And then they warn women, well, if you want to pursue your PhD, you should remember that you're like an aging pearl, a yellowed pearl. You're worth less after you graduate. And I mean, it's hard to say what all motivations are going into this, but one of the big things I think is you have this enormous gender imbalance in China. I think the number now, it's at birth, there's 116 boys born for every 100, for every 100 women. And if you look at history, when you have this situation, it turns to very ugly things. Society becomes much more violent. There's been a correlation, every 1% increase in the gender imbalance results in about a 4% increase in crime. So the government, I think, is quite aware of this, and they see educated women putting off marriage and not getting married at all, saying that, well, we already have this terrible situation, and if the available women are not getting married and pacifying these single men, then this could get quite ugly. So we want to push them into the marriage market as quick as is possible. So yeah, in that regard, and I think the phenomenon tends to be overblown. I think a lot of women are rejecting that. The pressure is great, but you still see, like in Shanghai, women are waiting until over 30 years old on average to get married. So marriage age is still definitely getting higher. Women not getting married is getting higher. But yeah, there's a lot of resistance to this, both politically and culturally, which puts a lot of women in a very tough spot. But we need to also keep in mind the rural half of China and how different things are there. Sorry to get too stat happy, but in 1990, urban women made 78% of what males did. That fell to 67% by 2010. Rural women made 79% of what men did in 1990. That's fallen to 56% now. So the gap is getting much wider between men and women, and that's especially true in the countryside. As China's economy is really blown up, you see these patriarchal tendencies re-emerging, and wealth is accumulating more around men than it is women. And when you have these huge imbalances, then that makes a very hard power dynamic between the wealthy men and the increasingly economically vulnerable women. So the countryside, it's getting kind of scary, this issue, these gaps, and like you see like a mistress culture re-emerging, and just men kind of leveraging the economic power they have over women, and of the position widening. So I think in this regard, in some ways, in absolute terms, women are making more money, but in relative terms, they're making less. So that could be a big issue. It already is a big issue to keep an eye on. And of course, this disproportionately affects young women first entering the workforce. And you have this huge gap that's there. It hits young women the worst.
I think it's a great question because it gets to the heart of how things actually work in China, and whether it's in companies, whether it's in political institutions. Like the people with the power in their 40s and 50s, generally if you're working and if you're in your 20s, you basically got to do what your boss says, even if it's a rubbish idea and they don't really know what they're doing. Let's take comedy for example. Filing Ho Tuokoxiao, that's a pretty popular TV show. I've watched it a couple of times. I don't think I laughed a single time. I mean, it's, do you find that show funny? It's got a few gags.
I guess I'm not a typical audience member, but the impression I get from a lot of people who come to our shows and hear that show, which is, it's called post-80s talk show. Talk show is the closest Chinese has towards a stand-up comedy. I guess the impression for people is saying, like, even if these jokes aren't hilarious, they're so much closer to what my life is about than traditional comedy is, or older comedy. So it's at least an affirmation of the world that the TV is talking about is at least the same world I live in.
Yeah. So my point is that show probably has a boss in his 40s and 50s, and it's being perhaps watered down for TV. Whereas if you go to a small comedy club and it's just a young Chinese guy like riffing off the news, that's going to be closer to the bone, funnier. I think that across the field, in media, journalists, in politics, like cadres, and in companies, whether they're startups waiting for their moment, or young Chinese rising up through the ranks. I think we're going to see some big changes in China in the next 20 years. I don't want to get into prediction mode, because that's dangerous.
That's always dangerous.
When the last generation retires, and the generation which I personally think have like a lot better ideas about how to do journalism, have a lot more sometimes I think have a lot more to say which is relevant to the China which I see around me. I'm really excited for 20 years time when the people who we're talking about now who are in their 20s have occupied sort of higher positions in companies and get to write the headlines rather than edit the copy.
I think in my case, when I was much younger, I had everything related to Chinese culture, like taking off wrapping up. That's something my grandpa listened to, and like the Chinese, like tea culture, I didn't pay attention to that at all. But as I grow older, I more and more can appreciate my own culture, because just as you said, it is the culture that where I come from, and I feel more proud. And now I think I think we should set the popular culture, for example, popular songs. Many musicians are trying to put the Chinese element into the popular songs, and then young people find, oh, this can be so cool. Like, if you tell them that you should learn it, they will refuse it sometimes. They don't want to listen to their parents and grandparents. But if there's a celebrity, like he or she is like wearing traditional Chinese clothes, then like young people like to follow.
I don't know, do you feel sometimes like people want to be more Chinese, want there to be more of a Chinese culture, but feel that it's often lacking? Because I mean, like any kind of media entertainment is so heavily censored that like producers will more often than not stick to very tried and true themes, whether it's a cheesy costume drama or an anti-Japanese film, where China hasn't really been able to let itself shine and contribute to international culture. So I don't know, I feel like young people sometimes want China to have more vibrant cultural contribution.
Yeah, sometimes it's about the form. Like for example, the Chulan, the Spring Festival Gala. People like to criticize it, but the people who make the gala say, oh, it's full of Chinese culture. But young people just don't care about it. They think, no, it's not my type.
Let me just piggyback a sort of tangential comment off the back of this, because time is limited, but so sort of taking this and running with it. But remember that China isn't just China, it's not just mainland China. I think that traditional Chinese culture, which I love, I'm a huge ancient China country fanboy. I think in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, those are young Chinese people too, I would say. China is more than just someone with sort of the red, or the little sort of 16-digit ID number in China. I think the idea of being Chinese goes beyond the borders of China, and that Chinese culture and sort of the continuity of Chinese culture is alive inside mainland China, but I think more visibly also in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. That's China too.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up. One thing I do want to say, I've got a QR code over here, so if you're interested in coming to more Sino-American Talks events in the future, you can scan the code, join our group. One thing I definitely want to do is say thank yous. I want to say thanks to Richard, who has been helping not only to run the cameras and the lights, but also to set it up. The video should be edited in a few weeks, and I'll be sharing that to the WeChat group. It'll go both on YouTube and on Youku, so if you're interested, you can look forward to that. I want to say a huge thank you to the team here at Project Pengyou. I never would have been able to pull off the event without enormous amounts of help and support from them. And naturally, to our panelists, who for some reason volunteered to come up here and let us grill them with miscellaneous questions. Thank you so much for being here. Would it be too much to ask for you guys to hang out for a few minutes and talk maybe one-on-one if people have some more questions for you?
It's free wine, right?
Absolutely. All right, well, that being said, thanks very much for coming. And this concludes our